as I kind of came into L&D, the light bulb just went. I said, hey, look, we're actually a provider of experiences of service. We actually are providing a product to people, to our humans. In our case, our humans are called learners. I feel like a lot of learning and development teams were thinking of their world the way tech teams were thinking about their world 2 decades back, a very waterfall sort of approach where someone would tell you, hey, go build this. You'd go into a black box, spend some time of development, a couple of months maybe, you develop it, and then you do this big bang approach, you launch it, and that's it. It would be given over to someone else, and then whoever this team was would sort of move on to do other things, right? I noticed one, that we were doing a lot of this waterfall work in learning and development while building a product. And then the second thing was most people in the L&D space have this frustration of, hey, we are considered order takers, we want to be more strategic. When you are constantly getting lists of requirements and then you give it back to someone else, like you can never be strategic. So to me, when I looked at both of those, I said, hey, we could actually do something similar in the people space.
Rashi, it's so great to have you here. I've really enjoyed getting to know you ever since we connected as McKinsey people working in sort of learning and development field. And I know you're doing some really cool transformative work now kind of as part of the people team at McKinsey. And I would love to sort of dive into it today. So thanks for joining.
Of course. And thank you so much for having me. I know we've had a few conversations. They've been fun. So hopefully this one's equal amount of fun.
Yeah. Well, I personally got really excited about it because there's a lot of overlap in the work that I used to do back at McKinsey and what you also used to do, which is leading transformations for organizations, especially the concept of going from project to product-based operating model and how that could help organizations bring higher customer service or things like that. And so I actually really wanted to sort of dive into the work you're doing there. I know at a high level, you are helping to bring this lens of product-based operating model to L&D. But let's first step back and maybe start by saying, how do you define product operating model and how does it differ from project operating model?
Yeah, no, the great question. And maybe I'll also start by saying what is a product, right?
Great.
What a product is, a lot of times people are not very clear. So in a very simple, I guess, way to think of a product really is that it could be a tangible item or it could be a service, but essentially it's something that adds value to an end user, right? So it's basically, you've got these needs and wishes and wants of, say, you can call them humans, you can call them customers, you can call them learners. And a product really is something that you take either in a tangible form, which is, here is a product, or a service that essentially meets those needs, right? And so if you kind of think about that, what the product operating model really is, that how your team is set up to serve those different products that eventually go to your end user versus kind of being siloed in ways in which traditional organizations operate, right? So in a lot of organizations, large organizations, of course, there are certain silos, there are certain functions, and in a lot of ways, the way internally companies' teams are sort of set up is how they were reacting or talking to the end users. But a lot of times, if you kind of flip the switch, you say, I am Vince, I am the end user, I consume a bunch of these products. And so it's taking your internal teams and setting them to serve whatever Vince's needs are. And maybe an easy way to explain it to people is, I guess, tech products that people are familiar with, right? So say take Uber, right? A lot of people likely know what Uber is. Now, Uber has product teams where somebody in Uber is looking at the Uber ride-hailing part of the product. Someone is looking at Uber Eats. And then within ride-hailing, there are people there. The teams have been set up where there's someone who's looking at like the driver side of the marketplace and looking at that kind of product, which is different from, the user side of the marketplace. So that's a little bit about sort of product operating model where you organize yourself in these products, which are meant to go on forever. So the big difference between, you said what is product versus project, is a project by its nature supposed to end, right? The idea of a project really is that it has a start date and then it sort of ends. You have a certain set of requirements that come in, you go through them. At a very clear point, you can say, okay, we have reached the end and now this is over and I'm going to jump on to maybe the next project. While a product really, I guess the big difference is that it goes on in perpetuity. So it's almost like the Uber app, like I said, or, Instagram, or take any of these other products that people may be familiar with. The tech products, they don't really end. There is no end to what you're building. So you're continuously working through it. So I think that's the big difference between it. And then there's obviously more details we can get into, how you organize the team, how do you invest, how do you fund these things? Those are slightly different. But I think at a fundamental level, the big difference is a product sort of is human-centered and user-facing. It goes on in perpetuity. A project is more defined by how you define things internally. There's a lot of handoffs that happen and it ends.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense and then resonates a lot. So it really kind of forces you to put yourself in the shoes of the users. And I think it really tries to minimize silos that may detract from the providing value to the users. So maybe let's talk a little bit about, okay, why does this mindset matter in L&D? Why did you decide, hey, this is something I think we should think about it at McKinsey's learning and development function? And what kind of issues is it actually tackling?
No, for sure. So like you mentioned, right, this is a lot of work I did across a lot of different clients I served in my sort of previous era at McKinsey when I was serving a bunch of clients. And as I kind of came into L&D, the light bulb just went. I said, hey, look, we're actually a provider of experiences of service. We actually are providing a product to people, to our humans. In our case, our humans are called learners. We don't call them users, but essentially they're humans that we're providing services to. And what really like surprised me was, again, using the tech kind of similarity, I feel like a lot of learning and development teams were thinking of their world the way tech teams were thinking about their world maybe 2 decades back, right? A very waterfall sort of approach where there would be a set of requirements that would come in. Someone would tell you, hey, go build this. They'd give you a bunch of clear requirements. You would have some sort of objectives written. You'd put in some KPIs, or sometimes they'd put in some KPIs, your stakeholders. You'd go into a black box, spend some time of development, a couple of months maybe, you'd develop it, and then you do this big bang approach, you'd launch it, and that's it. It would be given over to someone else, and then whoever this team was would sort of move on to do other things, right? So I noticed, one, that we were doing a lot of this waterfall work in learning and development while building a product. And then the second thing that I realized was most people in the L&D space, at least in the last year that I've spoken to, both within my organization and just generally in the community, a lot of them have this frustration of, hey, we are considered order takers. We want to be more strategic, right? And so to me, when you are constantly getting lists of requirements and only looking at a problem when someone tells you this is the problem, this is the scope, go build this, and then you give it back to someone else, like you can never be strategic because you're by its very nature taking in orders and instructions, right? And so to me, when I looked at both of those, I said, hey, we could actually do something similar in the people space, right? And L&D by its nature, if you kind of remove the fact that we're internal employee facing, it's literally the same thing, right? Like your product teams do this for clients who pay you with money. I guess your internal employees pay you with like attention and time.
I just love the way you're approaching the solving of, hey, like we don't want to be an order taker. We want to be strategic with an operating model change that inherently elevates the person who owns that, right? Because the challenge of a project-based model, to your point, is that you get very discrete requests. And of course, in that world, the person who makes the project request has the most context on that need. So then like they define what you want and then give it to you and you're sort of like, okay. And you could advise them a little bit, but they still have the full view of what they need on that little project. What happens with the product is that actually the person leading the product actually sees an expansive view of an end-to-end experience that not an individual person making requests understands. And you have in fact, you are empowered because you have to look at everything and you have to tell them like, this is the overarching experience and this is like how this fits in. And it necessarily makes the conversation strategic between the L&D lead and the business lead like making the request.
100%, right? And I think the other reason is it also empowers you, because this whole kind of narrative of we want to be strategic almost makes it feel like, you're a victim and someone needs to change how they look at you. I think this is almost in your control, and most, say, L&D leaders or people function leaders have this in their control just to change how they operate or how their teams operate, right? So I think it also sort of in a way gives you more agency to say, you will treat me however you want to. I can't go into your brain and like turn a switch. But if I start showing up differently and if my team starts showing up differently, eventually that evolution will happen, right? And I think I'm drawing similarities to the IT world. So I know you and I, did not start our career then, but when I spoke to a few of my clients who were, head of like technology or digital officers, some of them used to tell me that 25 years back, 30 years back, when they started their careers, IT was considered like a function that would literally sit in basements, right? They were not to be seen. Requirements would be thrown to them. They were considered a very sort of back office function, right? And so through this shift on how they started operating and how they started becoming more strategic and integral to business, one would now say they don't just have a seat at the table. In a lot of ways, they are the business, right? A lot of the CTOs eventually become like CEOs and run organizations. And so I think using that similar inspiration, you can say if that entire function went on this entire curve and has reimagined how important they are to an organization. At the early 2000s, the digital teams did it. Maybe now with like Gen AI as a little bit of our rocket fuel, we actually say, hey, look, like we need to keep like reimagining how people work, how work happens. And L&D actually has a very, very important role to play.
I love this. Okay. And I just love the framing of how you're marrying probably the number one thing I also hear all the time from L&D, but solving in this like really unusual way for L&D from a different function and changing the environment in which they operate. So I love it. But one of the things I would maybe ask before we get into the how of implementing of this new operating model is, from my experience, operating models all come with trade-offs, right? It's not like there's one universal operating model that's like better than everything else.
Yeah.
So what are some things to just note in terms of downsides or risks of a product operating model versus how things are getting done today?
Yeah. So I'd say I wouldn't call it a downside, but I think it's one of the biggest blockers, especially in like larger organizations. It requires a massive cultural shift, right? And it requires a lot of empowerment of like teams and those product teams, which are typically, say, a couple of levels removed from maybe the executive. So in a project-based organization, you can have a gatekeeper. You can have someone who sort of gets the input requirements, looks at it and says, you do this, and can stage gate things. I think in a product organization, what happens is you've got to empower like the product teams at that level to do the user research, do the continuous discovery, take out MVP products, test them, and actually say, this is what we think we should build. This is why we're building it. So it's a little bit of a cultural shift where there's a little bit of, I guess, giving up of some sort of control. And in places where there's a very traditional sort of command and control sort of structure, or, it's very top down, it's not a risk, but it requires a lot of upskilling, changing, both for people to give up some control who have it, but also to empower teams, right? It's easy to tell someone, go make a call. But if that person's grown up in an environment where they've always just had someone say yes, no to them, told them that, things have to go through a chain of commands, it's very difficult for even that individual at that level to feel empowered to go out and do these things. So I think that's possibly one big, I wouldn't call it a risk, but I just think it's one of those things to be aware of, that you need to do a cultural shift, top to bottom, literally. And then also with your stakeholders, right? Because the way you start showing up will slightly start changing. The other sort of, I wouldn't call it a risk, and there are ways to solve it, which we can get into it with some sort of pod constructs, is also this feels a lot like, hey, I'm blessed that I work in an organization where we have a lot of people doing learning and development. So we have a pretty large sort of team. But I've also met people where it's an L&D team of like 4. So then again, you could say, hey, like when I have a very small team, how do I have people who are constantly looking at, certain sort of products? And there are ways to solve it, but I think that could be a bit of a trade-off around, I have a small team, I need them to do a lot of different things to support the organization. We're like a COE sort of thing. How do I turn them into these teams in perpetuity? So I think that's a little bit of a maybe trade-off or something you've got to work around with just how many humans you have and then what's priority versus what's not. And then maybe the third thing also is, and you may have seen this in some of your projects back, when you were a consultant, is some of this kind of stuff requires a robust sort of strategy, long-term vision, right? You just don't change your op model and say, we're going to be product-centric and then just go out there. It doesn't have to be OKRs, but there has to be some vision. There has to be some, at least like quarterly business planning, something around this is what we're building. We're continuously looking at needs. We're prioritizing features or builds, etc. In the beginning can feel very slow to people, right? If people have sort of measured the competence of their team through throughput, right? How much things get into the system, they churn and they get out. It can feel very slow that this is a team that was delivering, 10 projects a month. And now they've spent like 2 months doing this like massive strategy effort and doing all this like learner or user research. So things just feel really slow. And I think that's a little bit like a spring. It'll feel slow and then things will happen really quickly. You'll accelerate. But maybe those are, I guess, a few big sort of trade-offs when you want to consider this model, right? There are a few things that you've got to kind of consciously agree that we'd be doing this. And it doesn't happen in a month. You've got to at least give it a go for a year and a half and say, we're going to try this properly.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me. One of the things that I feel like I noticed when I was helping clients transition to the product operating model, back when I was a consultant, was actually on paper, sometimes it could look like very resource intensive, right? Because you're creating these persistent teams, as you said. And like every team needs a kind of this diverse set of talents. And you're like, okay, like we're just adding more and more teams. And the thing that actually happens is when the product team starts to operate efficiently, they move way faster, like getting stuff done. So like the actual amount of work that gets done could be far more, even if like the sheer number of like headcounts might be like slightly more, like the work output is even more. But now that is often unproven operating model in an organization. And they're also like, mandate has become, to your point, like narrower because each team is doing like a specific product versus like being able to do like a whole bunch of different things. So I can definitely see a little bit of resistance or friction if it's not framed the right way in the right organization with very constrained resources.
Precisely. And I think that some of these skills, because you work in smaller decentralized teams, like a lot of people get upskilled very quickly with different skills. And then it's also 2025. And if we don't mention Gen AI tools, it also feels like, are we in 2025? The reality is a lot of things, I think, with the right tools can also be accelerated, right? So back in the day, maybe every team did need like a person with specific bespoke, say, user research skills. It's a discipline. It's an art. I started my career as someone who did it. So I will never kind of downplay the skill.
Right.
But I also think with the right tools and resources, a lot of people can be upskilled, right? So you may have like one sort of expert who floats around and upskills people, but a bunch of these skills can truly be democratized, right? So it shouldn't really feel like, oh, I need a pod of like X number of people. The challenge, which also a lot of people like look at it and freak out, is, people forget the difference between being agile and doing agile. And a lot of people focus a lot on the process, and I have to do a stand up and a squad needs X number of people and I need these resources, without realizing that the spirit of this thing says you must know who your end learners are, break your organization into learner facing journeys, keep like testing things, right? Like just ship things a lot faster. So I think as long as like, depending on the context of an org and how big or small they are, they stick to the spirit of what it is, I think it's easy to implement it. But if you get lost in like the prescriptiveness of it and, looking at like, these are the 10 rules and this is like how my team needs to be set up, I agree with you. It can like be, I don't think, we're big enough to do this.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to start a bit into specifics.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first thing would be actually to be able to paint in a little bit more like tangible way what is an example of a product team.
Yeah.
And what would be a project team, so people can like actually visualize, okay, this is what a product team could look like, this is what might make up this team, and this is what they might be working on, versus this is what a project team is. So can we maybe start there, and then I want to ask you about how do you put something like that in place?
Sounds good. So maybe one way to kind of visualize it for people is, let's say, you're a learning and development team, and in most organizations, right, you have your employees and they're sort of on a journey, or you can logically break them down into certain kind of journey, right? There's definitely a bespoke sort of onboarding product or journey, and that's usually pretty constrained in time, but it's one sort of distinct journey. Then usually there's a journey of like, say, individual contributors, entry-level people, right? Again, that's a journey that has its own very bespoke sort of learning and development requirements, certain skills. Then let's say there's the middle management layer, right? And then there's, call it the executive team. So even if you think about it, like if you break it down in any organization, you say there are these 4 big sort of journeys. The way I was saying about setting up a product team, if I'm an L&D leader and then say I've got a team of even 10 people, what I could do is I could have 4 people becoming my sort of journey owners, right? And so there's one person who looks at onboarding as a journey. So that entire onboarding journey is a product. There's someone who looks at, say, the ICE journey, someone middle management and someone executive. Once you've kind of defined your product layer, these are the people who, are continuously talking to their counterparts, are continuously learning more about who these people are, how their interventions are doing, etc. They're the ones who are kind of at that strategic sort of strategy layer, thinking about the function, the needs, are in constant touch with different stakeholders and are determining for their own sort of product, what are the feature sets, what needs to be built, what needs to be updated, what needs to be tested, given what's happening, right? And then under them, people would call them projects, but I call them the feature layer. You could have, say, let's assume I am looking at this journey of, say, middle managers, right? I could have, say, a middle manager in-person training, a big training that people do when they, get formally promoted into this role, right? That could be an in-person program. I could have job aids. I could have something available for them in the flow of work. I think of those as features. Those can be switched on and off. And those together have to make sense at my strategy level, right? Those become like channels or distribution of how something happens. That to me is like a product org construction where you've got somebody, not everybody needs to do it, but somebody in your team who's sort of thinking about that strategy, who's talking about to the journey manager before and after how things are connected. So it feels seamless and is making decisions around what gets updated where, how do things speak to each other. And the flip side would be in a project organization, what you would probably do, you would say, okay, somebody tells us Gen AI is coming up, the way our managers work is going to change, go build a learning program on Gen AI. So you get a group together, you get someone from your team to kind of project manage the team to make sure timelines are met. You get like a designer, you have a bunch of SMEs who they talk to once in a while. They'll sort of build something. Sometimes they'll test it, sometimes they won't. Someone will put a KPI, they'll say this is ready, and they release it, right? And they only think about their life as a program. Like it's a very program centric or a very tool centric view versus kind of connecting it to that entire end-to-end experience.
Got it. Yeah. So I think the big shift to your point from for a lot of organizations would be they often define like a unit of work or like someone's responsibility as here's a program, go build this program. Here's this like thing we need to do and like do it. And instead of that, the organizing principle first and foremost is what is as the end participant or the learner, what are they going through? And somebody actually thinks about that person's end-to-end experience and is stitching together the different features to your point or the actually different programs and interventions in a way that makes sense for the end participants.
100%. And the big advantage of that also, so the other thing when I came into the space, I heard a lot of people talk about is, we want to be more learner-centric, right? I was like, well and good. What does that mean? They obviously want to do right by their learners, by their users, right? But if you are organized in a very program-centric manner, you have a very inside-out view of the world. All that means is, Vince, you own program A, I own program B. I spent my entire day thinking about program B. And so I optimized metrics around how many people signed up, what was the NPS for my program, did people have a great experience, and that's it, right? But that end impact and the fact that, it sounds bad for the ego, but this is my first thing when I came into this role. I told people, I said, hey, look, a lot of our learners are very busy people. For me, as Rashi, learning might be all I think about. It's my day job. For a lot of these people, it's not even 5% of how much headspace they give to this, right? If we only optimize for how we're set and we only think about this, we sometimes miss the fact that for these people, they don't think in these silos, right? Like I, as an employee at an organization, don't think of my life as program A, program B. And if I do, then I optimize for the wrong things, right? I turn this into, okay, I'm going to travel. I'm going to have a break from work. I'm going to meet some people. But the learning aspect of it, the fact that you're on this journey, the fact that things are building on top of each other, you forget. And sometimes you also build these programs because some, senior person had a hypothesis that this was needed. Unless someone's constantly in touch with the learners and is looking at it strategically, you don't rationalize or sunset it at the right time, or you don't kind of reopen it at the right time. And you're only being reactive, right? So this approach also makes you a little proactive, which is how you become learner-centric, right? Before some random person tells you that, hey, all your program material is outdated and it's been a year since it's been outdated, you actually have someone in your team who's constantly in touch with these learners, with, their sort of bosses, their talent management teams, however you're set up, and can bring that to the table and make the changes before someone else tells you changes are needed.
I love it. Let's maybe think through how this works in practice. So I know you've started to introduce this concept into McKinsey itself. I'm curious if you can share maybe an example of which area can you ended up looking to go after, what improvements you are seeing, and what metrics you decide to put in place to be able to sort of make this transition.
Yeah. So again, without getting too much specifics, I'll keep it specific enough so it paints a picture and, still generic enough. Is I'm looking at what is called our team leader sort of journey. So think of these as people who, like I said, are moving into, the middle management sort of role. They're moving in from individual contributors, leading teams, all the way till they exit into what we would call our sort of executive level teams. They become, directors or associate partners, etc. at the firm. So I look at that journey. And what we did was, we said, hey, instead of us looking at, and this, we're in a firm which is very people kind of focused. So there are lots of interventions, lots of tools, lots of programs. And instead of saying, hey, I oversee 4 in-person programs plus 5 of these tools, we said, no, I'm looking at the entire journey. And the way you'd have like a software, development team, I am the journey owner, which looks at the strategy ops side of it. There is a senior sort of expert who has deep expertise in learning science, etc., who's like works with me. Together, we're a team that looks at the entire sort of end-to-end journey. And at that level, we work with all our subject matter experts. We interact with our people leaders, etc. at that level. And then within it, what we did was we said that'd be like 3 people who own, if you think of this journey, it goes on for a few years. We logically broke it down into early, mid, senior within the journey. And we said one person looks at early, another person's going to look at mid, another person's going to look at senior. And then within that person's team, like the early, there are a couple of like products that are being built, right? Like some of it could be in person. One of it's a digital tool that's being built. Another is an assessment that's being built. So what happens is that I kind of look at the whole thing. This person's looking at everything globally that's needed for people transitioning into this role and in their first kind of 0 to 9 months. And so what that really is doing for us, to your point, is that a lot of people are feeling pretty empowered because they know their audience now inside out, right? It's so much easier for them to take things and connect it and build things saying, this is what they did in the digital module. Then they come in person in a couple of months and this is how things get reinforced and upped. And then this is what the assessment does. And then this is where they go next. So I think just the general sense of empowerment that people are feeling has been great. I'd say speed of delivery is also increased, right? Because in a waterfall, what would happen is, like I said, there are maybe close to 10, 12 different things inside this, right? And this is at a global level. If we were going to do waterfall, it would be very slow. We'd probably do one, finish it, then go to the next. By the time we go to the third thing, that thing needs to be changed because the world's changed. And so now what's happening is we're moving pretty quickly, and then things are happening simultaneously instead of them being sequentially. And so the third thing that's also happened is to the point around a seat at the table. I think a lot of people are looking at folks from our team as true voice of these individuals, right? We're not just moving pretty fast and collaborating well with each other and our internal sort of subject matter experts. We've also created like a beta testing group of some of our sort of end learners. Every 2-3 weeks, we test things with them. It could be a small module. It could be a new tool. We get feedback from them, informal sort of their review conversations. We, at an aggregate level, are hearing what's happening. We're in touch with different sort of stakeholders who evaluate them or work with them, their bosses and their teams. And so all of us have a very, very deep understanding of who these people are, right? And I think that's also really been helpful for us, including the people who are designing on our team, because they're not moving from a project to a project. They're like, oh, I understand this human being inside out now. It's much easier for me to build something for them versus kind of get a set of requirements or do like 5 interviews at the start of a project to just tick off a box.
Right. That's awesome. And that reminds me how one of the big benefits of this operating model is that people feel really energized, and like generally the productivity and like the effectiveness of the team improves quite a bit, because now everyone necessarily get to be strategic, but it's kind of fun strategic work too.
100%, right? And you have a strong perspective, which is what I say, that like, I don't think everybody needs to push back all the time, but all of them have a perspective now. And if so, somebody randomly has an idea and says, go build this. In the past, you'd take that requirement in and someone would scramble and put something together. I think now people feel empowered to say, hey, like, why do you want this? What are you trying to get? Oh, okay, that already gets it. Or we think that's the right place for us to build it. And so the team feels pretty empowered, saying that, look, like, you tell us your problem statement and you tell us what you need. We as the team have the expertise to decide where and how it will show up, and or also deprioritize that as a feature, right? Be like, yes, it's important, but not really, because there are like 10 other things that we know are higher priority order.
Okay. Cool. And I'm curious if you faced any barriers as you try to get this launched, and what surprised you?
Yeah, so I'd say in some sense, I'm super blessed, because I know right from the top, some of our really senior leaders in the firm, learning, are excited about this way of being. And I think a large part of why I even got this role was I spent my entire 30 minutes in that interview just talking about, like, why don't you do this, right? Like, and so they got pretty energized and they said, come and do this for us. So luckily for me, right from the top, there was a lot of air cover or to do it. And we'd framed it as a pilot, right? So it's a little bit of, I think it makes people feel safer that this is a pilot. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I wouldn't call it a barrier, but I think initially people were there was a little bit of maybe confusion as to how this will happen. There was a little bit of fear around, are we going to be moving unnecessarily too fast, right? It's also, I think people also hear some of these things, like I said, around, we got to release things quicker. We're going to start building things. There's obviously more transparency gets created in the system, right? And so there is this little fear sometimes for people who are very set in how they've done things. That is, like, empowerment is a double-edged sword. I think some people really want it and they blossom, and then there are some people who are, this is too much, right? There's too much pressure on me. I'm too exposed, because I now go in for demos to like our senior most leaders, and I'm
right,
steer codes, just showing actual products or actual content that we are building. I wouldn't say there was a lot of cultural resistance. I think most people sort of like this idea, but we did spend like 3-4 days talking about it with a smaller group that was going to do this. We met in person, and I think we did spend some time just building trust amongst each other, because I was coming new into this team. They didn't know me. We did upfront spend some time and effort of just building trust. And then I did a lot of stakeholder conversations. Like, I almost sometimes felt like a bureaucrat, but I went around literally the globe, around all our big stakeholders, and told them, this is what we're doing. This is what we're changing. This is how we'll work. This is how our team's going to interact with you. So I think all that sort of helped. There was no real active, at least I didn't hear it. Maybe there was, but I don't think there was any active sort of resistance or someone saying, this will fail.
Yeah. I mean, I think with that said, that's probably also because everyone felt that it's bringing some level of improvement or benefit that they've been seeking or they think is timely, right? So maybe like in that conversation with senior executives that got them so excited and bought in,
Yeah.
was there anything that stood out to you as like, oh yeah, they think it's solving this problem or they think it's using this opportunity they've seen for a while, but this seems like a really interesting way to do it?
Yeah, maybe two things, right? One, I said this whole idea of like learner centricity, right? It's one of those things that keeps getting spoken about. It we spoke a lot about it, so I don't want to get into that. And the other thing was actual impact on the job, right? I think the biggest frustration of really senior leaders in the people space sometimes is in L&D for sure. And you can't do direct attribution of everything, but their biggest frustration was that a lot of times we measure impact in a very like inside view of the world, right? Like I said, like, did people have fun? Yes, no. But learning need not always be fun. Sometimes it can be deeply uncomfortable, but are you showing impact on the job, and that matters? What this helps do also is that because you sort of link it at the entire journey level and you get people into this habit that learning is something that's going to happen in the flow of work, learning is not just something in person in a program. There are different ways in which you can do it all the time through different modalities. And then impact is going to be measured on, hey, like as a macro sort of cohort, when you go in for your reviews, do we see certain shifts in certain skills? That sort of also got them very excited because it helps organize the team in a way where people also start thinking like that. Otherwise, in the past, you'd go back with metrics like value for time spent was this, right? Again, it's nothing wrong in isolation, but that doesn't really mean that like actual business impact was realized or not.
Got it. Interesting. Okay, so I would love to hear then, now that this pilot is actively underway and you're starting to see some of the changes in how the team operates and shifts and stuff like that, what lessons are you pulling out from it? What either surprised you or what are you learning that you find valuable?
In most cases, if you empower the team and if you give them, if you even upskill L&D folks, right? Because a lot of people want to do this. And I think the challenge for a lot of people is A, they don't know how to do it, or B, there's, like I said, you read like 5 books and it feels very processy. And then people go and implement stand-up. So they go and start using post-it notes. And then they're like, why aren't we becoming a product org? So I think the big lesson for us is that once you actually help people understand what the true spirit of this thing is, and you sort of contextualize it for your environment, and I think that's sort of helpful because I'd done this across so many different organizations. I could see patterns and then I could bring it in the context of what we were doing. And you take out some of the jargon, right? And translate it into what it means for people. A lot of people naturally just pick it up really quickly, right? And I think some of your biggest sort of, not cheerleaders, but the people I think who get it really, really quickly are a lot of your designers, right? So if you work with instructional designers or anybody with that sort of, I think they pick it up really quickly. A, like a lot of them have been trained to understand this. And I think B, to tell them that, hey, we're empowering you. You will get to work closely with this entire cohort of learners. You'll continuously keep testing your stuff before it's launched. So I felt like they were a group that really quickly like picked it up and really wanted to do it. And it was very similar to, how they think and work. And for the rest, as long as you sort of empower people and people are on their own journey, I think most people got this way of working. In the beginning, I'd say it seems very overwhelming, but as soon as you spend some time, contextualize it for people and do it with what's needed for your sort of organization and context, people got it. So I think I wouldn't call it surprising, but I really liked how like so many people like stepped up, and now I see a bunch of them and I'm like, wow, like in the last 4-5 months of doing this, I can see that transformation of them just becoming very, very strategic in how they think and how they are operating. And then maybe I'd say one of the biggest sort of lessons that I may have learned in implementing this is also a little bit of, you've got to go do a storytelling on your own, right? So if you have to convince your own leaders or the broader org, I would just say it's very important to explain the from to, like how we were, how are we shifting, what's our hypothesis. And then I think just calling it a pilot or just saying we're experimenting, like even for somebody who's listening to this, right, they want to do it in their org, instead of big bang saying my entire team's operating model will switch, make sure that it's critical, but if it blows up, it doesn't take everything down, but it also should not be something that nobody cares about because then you don't get anything out of it. So just identify sort of the right cohort or the right level, just find a couple of people who you can upskill in this way of being or who'd be excited to try this, and then just give them some breathing room to do it. Because I think a lot of times with leaders also, if you show a lot of impatience early on, when people are upskilling and trying something new, it can kind of kill it. It has a gestation period, right? This thing requires someone to have the patience. Make sure you set it up for yourself, right? It's very important if you want to try this, that you have the right kind of support from the right people in the organization to give you the air cover. It's not like a switch and you can't do it the next day.
For sure. Last question for you would be, people might be listening and intrigued by it. I think operating model changes are quite difficult and often really hard to conceptual unless you've done it. It's like, exactly what is it? I bet actually a lot of people are also being like, I don't quite grasp it yet, like what the project or the product is. Unless you actually live it, it just feels like you're like shifting boxes and lines.
Yeah.
In reality, the operating model is quite different when you transform. How would you recommend people learn more about it or get started on it in this direction if they are intrigued by what we discussed?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, there are basic 101 sort of product management books. I say you could read them, with the caveat being don't spend too much time, because if you start to understand the mindset shifts and the principles, and then you should be able to at some point say this is not applicable to us, as long as don't get lost in the process, right? Like I said, people read these things and then they get so lost in the process that they just abandon it. I would just say there are like 2-3 things, right? The spirit of it that you need to think about, right? One is this idea of what I call continuous discovery, which most product teams follow. So the idea of continuous discovery is that like research and understanding the needs of your sort of learners or your users should not happen only at the start of these big projects, right? Do you have someone in your team? Maybe it's one individual, maybe it's a group of individuals who, for these big cohorts, is at a certain cadence, meeting them, talking to their sort of stakeholders, and really understanding who these humans are, right? Like you truly understand their world and where you fit into their world, and how can you sort of, what is the job you have to do in their life, right? So do you truly understand these people beyond them just being manager or a title, or they're in marketing, or this person's in like engineering, right? So I'd say that's one big spirit, is like, can you set up some sort of a process in your team, even if you don't change the full operating model, where you can do some sort of a continuous discovery. The second thing, and I love this as a concept, and I used to use this all the time, was called dog fooding. So the idea of dog fooding really is to taste your own product. And so that means, as much as possible, can you get to immerse yourself in the life of your kind of user, right? It could be shadowing. So let's say if you're building some sort of a sales enablement tool, or you're building a tool for, say, call center agents, right? A lot of clients do a lot of learning and development for front of the line people. Is there a world in which you or someone from your team can figure out a way with the head of the call center where for 2-3 days you actually become a call center rep at a certain cadence? Because unless you have lived that life, or you can get as close to living that life, that level of empathy and understanding what am I trying to solve, and at how do they need learning, when do they need learning, will never happen, right? So that's the other thing that I tell people in this product world is, even if you don't change how you're set up and you still want to do this whole project management way, can you somehow create some ways to do this dog fooding thing, right? Where you actually go taste your own product, or get as close as you can, right? To see, not just go take the training, but kind of play the role that the training is supposed to enable. So it's like Vince took the training, but now Vince actually has to go and answer those calls for like 2 days, and you see, and that I think teaches you a lot. So for me, maybe like those would be like advice, right? Just like read a little bit about it. There's so much information about product management. I think there are a bunch of people, folks like you and me, right, who have played this product role, who are now in people L&D. Like I'd say reach out to folks and just, sometimes even just talking to someone for like 10-15 minutes makes it easier than reading 10 books. And then the third would be just the spirit, right? The spirit really is, how can you continuously discover needs? How can you constantly be strategic before the needs kind of come to you and you're not being reactive? And how are you, as much as possible, dog fooding? That's at least like helpful to get started with.
Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thought here. Given now I've seen, being in the L&D field for a few years now, the amount of times people talk about wanting to transition from order taker to being more strategic, wanting to be more learner-centric, wanting to drive more business impact. Your perspective as a transformation specialist in the business and product context, and that thinking being applied to L&D is like a really interesting way to add to that conversation. And so I really hope that we get to talk more about this as well. And I would love for more people to also just start thinking about their organization this way and start experimenting more at the operating model layer. Appreciate you joining.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. And, I know I geek out about this stuff like all the time. So it's just good to know that, you as someone who's seen so much more of this space across a bunch of different organizations feels like this is the time. And maybe this is some answers, right, to some of these problems people are sort of struggling or grappling with. And just excited that you gave me a platform to share my thoughts.
Thanks, Rashi.
Thank you, Vince.